Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. 2 hours of scary stories as per usual. I hope you all enjoy them. Also, I'm sorry for this video being like 2 or 3 days late. I got sick. I had like half of it recorded and then I got sick, and I usually just record whether I'm sick or not, but it was just a bit too difficult, so you'll have to forgive me. But now I feel better. I finished the video, so here it is. You're welcome. Drop a like if you do enjoy. Subscribing if you are new is also very much appreciated. And as always, I hope you all have a great night. Nothing is working. I can't get out. Every time I try, it's the same. I never should have been fooled by that flyer. Treasure? Yeah, right. I'll be lucky to get out of this alive. It started with that weird paper I found on my car in the parking lot earlier today. It was some sort of flyer advertising. Trick or treat for treasure. Real gold, precious gems, and more. All yours for the taking. If you are brave enough, join us tonight at 5 p.m. 10/30/2024 at the Center Street Mall. If you dare. Costumes mandatory. It seemed like some sort of event or contest. I started to wonder if there was a legitimate prize or if this was some sort of scam. If it was some sort of Halloween contest and they were giving out actual treasure, I might be in for it. I was getting kind of crappy hours this time of year at work, so I would not turn down the prospect of a big prize. I had no plans for Halloween Eve anyway, so I thought, what the heck, why not? As I was reading the flyer and making my decision, my friend and coworker Scott clapped me on the back and asked, "What are you reading?" I regarded him and showed him the flyer. Some kind of contest. Check it out. There might be a legit prize or something. We should go. He raised an eyebrow but did not hesitate too long before responding. Yeah, let's do it. Nicole might want to go too. She's always down to check out Halloween decorations and spooky stuff, so she would love an excuse to go trick-or-treating. I'll call her now. It was decided, and we went home to get ready. I got a blue jumpsuit and Michael Myers mask and took an empty pillowcase like I used to when I was a kid going trick-or-treating. I figured if they really did give out valuables to the winners, it might be a take all the loot you can carry, and I would need something to haul it in. I felt a bit silly, but if it was real, I wanted to be ready. I got in my car and drove off to pick up Scott and Nicole. Scott was dressed as a pirate and Nicole was dressed as a witch. We regarded each other's costumes and enjoyed the nostalgic feeling of getting ready to go trick-or-treating. We arrived at the location at 4:50 p.m. and got out. I thought it was a bit strange since the Central Street Mall had been closed down due to a fire that destroyed much of the building. It had never reopened, but I guess somehow these people got a permit to host an event here. We found a few other people waiting there in costume, so at least we were not alone. I was looking around for some sort of event official to see if we should wait in a specific area. Scott and Nicole had struck up a conversation with two people wearing a ghost face and zombie getup. I waited and watched my phone, and at 5 p.m. on the dot, a large black van pulled into the parking lot. It had tinted windows and a small logo on the side that said, "Trick or Treat." It parked nearby, and a tall man in a large white sheet that made him look like a cheap ghost stepped out. He spoke very curtly, saying, "Is this everyone?" I looked around and saw a decent group of other people, and we all nodded in unison. He clapped his hands together and proclaimed, "Good, very good. Now a few ground rules about how this is going to work. The old stores in this mall have been converted into a haunted village, so we have a large group of makeshift houses with real hardwood doors, decorations, and everything. Besides the eye candy of our authentic set, they have something I know you will all be interested in. You are allowed and encouraged to knock at every door and trick or treat as normal. The gifts these tenants give out will run the gambit from cash to valuable gems, gold, and silver. All of this treasure is real, I assure you. You are, of course, allowed to keep whatever you can take out." The group seemed excited, and were about to cheer at the declaration, but the man in the ghost costume interrupted and held out his arm in a flourish and continued. "Now you might be thinking, what's the catch? Well, I am glad you asked. Once you are in there, you will not be allowed out until you can find the main door's release switch, but I must warn you it is well hidden, on top of whatever you can get with trick-or-treating. If you are able to make it out, you will win a prize of $100,000. We all gasped when we heard the crazy amount of prize money. If they were willing to shell out that much to the winners, I was thinking that this was going to be tougher than I expected. The man in the ghost costume resumed his explanation. "Now, you will not be alone in there. Besides the villagers, there is something else that stalks the shadows. This other visitor is there for treats of his own, and if it catches you, well, let's just say you will be out of the contest." I heard a grim chuckle coming from underneath the cheap sheet, and figured he was trying to play up the scary angle to this event. He continued with his instructions. "Now, the people in the village are there to help, but only if you follow their rules. You are to remain in costume at all times. You are to say trick or treat at every door. You are not to try and enter their houses no matter how desperate you are. You are to say thank you after visiting each house. You are not to try and sneak out through any other means. If for any reason you do not abide these rules, the villager who catches you is authorized to ring the disqualification bell, which will see you removed from play. Occasionally the villagers will ring a town bell and lock their doors. This is the only warning alarm you will get when danger is near, and you should indeed be careful. Danger stalks the shadows. You will have to run or hide, though I would not advise the former. It is very fast." He did his best ominous laugh as he finished up, and waved us toward the entrance. We looked at each other. Everyone was a little unsure. What exactly was the danger stalking the shadows? I was wondering myself if they were really giving out valuables, or if this was some sort of trick. I also wondered what the alarm was for. I wondered if the danger was a person in costume trying to scare us like a haunted house. It seemed like if you broke the rules or got caught, you would lose your loot. As I was contemplating the rules, Nicole asked a question. "What happens if we need to leave early? Like for a legitimate emergency? Is there some sort of emergency exit?" We saw the man under the sheet shake his head and respond. "No, I am afraid you will have to exit like everyone else. If you are unable to continue, then I would suggest finding a good hiding spot and waiting for your fellow participants to open the door. Once you are in, the front door will be the only way back out. Also, cell phones must be checked at the door. You will be able to retrieve them when you leave. Don't try to sneak them in. That will be considered a violation of the rules. No unfair advantages. If anything is not agreeable and you do not wish to participate, let us know now. Otherwise, enter and conquer your fears. Good luck." He waved his hand and it seemed he was departing before answering any other questions people had. There was some sort of staged fog or smoke screen, and he had suddenly vanished. The little magic act elicited a few cheers of awe of the stunt, but I wondered what we were supposed to do to get in. As if on cue, there was a loud rumbling sound and the heavy-duty doors on the entrance swung slowly open. Next to the door we saw a small lockbox with an aperture wide enough for our phones. One by one we dropped them in. I didn't feel great about doing so, and I was even more paranoid this was a scam and we were going to come back and they would be gone. Scott and Nicole dropped their phones in and moved on, so I just did the same. We moved beyond the threshold with our small group. There were 15 people when we had arrived, Yet when I looked around before stepping through the door, it seemed we had lost 3. A dozen players in total moved into the darkness and braced ourselves for the challenge. The main door led through a narrow hall that was dimly lit. I could barely see in front of myself, and Scott and Nicole huddled close to try and not get separated. We were positioned around the middle of the row of players. The person in front was dressed as a Jedi, and had a lightsaber that conveniently lit up at least some of the dark hall. We followed the narrow tunnel-like path, and as we all moved further inside, we heard the heavy entrance doors slam shut behind us. They were not joking. We were really locked in. I felt bad since someone near the back of the line heard the same sound and started panicking and saying he did not know there would be the dark tunnel and such confined space. He said he had claustrophobia and needed to get out. Another player stayed behind with him, and his pleas for help and knocking on the door faded as the rest of us moved further in. Fortunately, we soon saw a much stronger source of light. We had arrived in the so-called village. The area, which I think used to be the mall's food court, had been transformed into a Dark Ages-style town square. The light was emanating from a large bonfire in the center of the square. The smoke wafted up into an open skylight that allowed for some ventilation. There were huddles of small houses that looked handmade and very authentic to the theme they were going for. "This is so cool," Nicole shouted out in glee as she admired the decorations. Besides the houses and other structures, there were a lot of other cool details. I had to hand it to them. The smaller flourishes were awesome. There was fake blood on the doors and the ground. Large dents and slash marks were on many surfaces. Even if I lost, I thought this might still be fun just for the experience. Scott and Nicole shared in the enthusiasm of arriving, and we looked at each other and smiled and set about our treasure hunting. Scott pulled us along, saying, "Come on, let's hurry, the others have already started." He was right. The rest of the players had split up and were knocking at doors while we stood there. I agreed with him and pointed to the first house on the left and said, "Alright, let's start on the left and work our way in a nice circuit around the square, and we can move further in then. Let's see if they really are giving away treasure." We moved up to the first house and knocked on the door. An older-looking woman wearing a domino-style face mask answered. She looked at us and waited, and I couldn't believe I almost forgot on the first house. We all said it together. "Trick or treat." The woman smiled and reached into a small pouch she carried and produced 3 large red objects. She dropped them into our bag, and I looked down and saw something I could barely believe. The treat was a gemstone which looked like an actual cut ruby. I could not tell, but based on the size and guess of the carat, it looked like it would run several $1,000s. Scott looked on in disbelief and asked, "Do you think this is real?" And Nicole's eyes widened when she saw hers and indicated, "I think these are real. They weren't joking. We gotta do more. Let's go." We were about to leave, but I remembered a rule right before we got burned by it. I turned around and said, "Thank you." Scott and Nicole followed my lead, and after we thanked for the incredible treasure, she closed her door and we moved on to the next house. We visited 2 more houses, and were surprised and delighted by the offerings. The second house gave out gold bars, which also looked completely authentic, and the third house was handing out billfolds with $1,000 in cash inside them. 3 houses in and we felt rich already. We eagerly moved on to the 4th house when we heard a bell ring and raised voices. It sounded like an argument and someone was shouting in the distance. We approached and saw a man dressed in a devil costume banging on a door to one of the houses. The bell chimed again from inside, and the man in the devil costume screamed. No, it's not fair, I just forgot. I was going to say it. You can't kick me out. Come on, I need this money. This is BS. You can't just make me leave. I'm taking this money, you can't stop me. He went on into an even worse tirade of colorful language, and it seemed like the issue was he had forgotten a rule and was out now. We watched on as he continued to rage. Suddenly another bell chimed in the distance, answering the first, and we heard a louder bell ringing from somewhere in the town square. This was followed by the sound of bars being placed on the interiors of doors and lights being turned out. Guys, we should hide. I think that is the alarm. Scott and Nicole nodded, and we found an area with a few crates next to the last house we had visited. The other players dispersed as well, except for the man in the devil costume who kept pounding on the door of the villager, who had caught him breaking the rules. The rest of the area became deathly quiet, and suddenly I felt a disturbing chill in the air, and heard the faint rustling of something large moving nearby. I was wondering if the person in the stalker costume was supposed to bounce people if they broke the rules. We all watched in our hiding places as the light dimmed near the house, and the man in the devil costume turned around and noticed the entire area was empty. Alright then, I'll go. But I am taking the stuff I got so far. Just try and stop me. He was not going without a fight. I wondered how they would handle someone disrupting the game. I didn't have to wait long. A looming shadow appeared behind the man as he was bellowing his challenge. He paused and was just turning to face it when it crashed down onto him, and there was a blood-curdling scream and he had vanished. The man was gone, and all that was left was a red stain where he had been standing and a fallen bag. I was impressed at how realistic it was. I wondered if some of the other players were plants, and they were trying to help them put on a show. Other players hiding nearby were gasping out loud, and some were trembling in their own hiding spots. It was quite the show. Even I was getting a little tense. As I was considering what was going on, Scott moved out of our hiding spot and crept toward the red stain where the man had been and whispered, "Mine now." He was quickly grabbing the contents of the man's bag, and a big smile spread on his face as he saw the gems and cash that he would be taking. I was concerned, since I did not hear anything to indicate it was safe to resume. Then I heard the same rustling sound and saw the shadowy form appear behind Scott. Before I could issue a warning, it was over. He was not pulled up and away, though. Scott was hit from behind and fell on his face. The attack looked too real and sounded like actual impact and painful tearing. My immersion was broken, and I was suddenly very concerned. I went to check on him. I wasn't going to let some actors actually harm my friends or anyone else. I heard a disturbing gurgling sound and a horrible crunching and chewing and then running. The town bell rang again, the lights came back on and the trick-or-treating could resume. Nicole and I went up to Scott, who had not gotten back up yet. We guessed someone would escort him to the exit since he was out. When Nicole touched Scott, he did not respond, and when she rolled him over, she let loose a haunting shriek. I looked down at what she had seen. Scott had half of his head removed, sliced clean off. He was laying on the ground dead. Warm blood soaked the area around his lifeless corpse, and I saw in nauseating detail the better part of his brain leaking onto the floor. I dropped my own bag in disbelief and horror. It was not just for show. They were actually going to kill us if we were caught. Nicole was still screaming and starting grasping at my arm, shouting that we needed to leave. I agreed and we went back the way we had come from and sprinted to the main door. We heard screams from elsewhere in the village, and it signaled that others had realized the true danger and horror of what was really happening. We were not alone in our flight, and a couple in Raggedy Ann and Andy costumes were ahead of us, and arrived at the door and started pounding on the massive gate, screaming to be let out. We moved next to them and added our own chorus of pleas, but there was no response. My heart sank when I remembered that the only way to open the door was to find a well-hidden switch, no exceptions. I pulled Nicole aside and she was near catatonic with fear. I tried to help her focus and spoke as softly but directly as I could. Nicole, I know you are scared. I am too, but we need to get out. The switch. We have to find it. They are not going to let us out. We have to find the switch to open the door. She started to settle her breathing down and nodded her head and agreed. I know, I can't believe they killed him. I can't believe they are doing this. What was that thing? How was it so fast? That can't be a normal person. It looked like a monster. She was starting to lose it again and I told her, I don't know. I have no idea. It does not matter. We need to find that switch to get out of here alive. Please, we need to go now. Nicole followed me, and I tried to convince the others by the door to help us search. They kept trying the door, and eventually the girl dressed as Raggedy Ann said, Maybe it can't get us by the door. It isn't here. It is near the houses. We are staying here. As soon as it opens, we are getting out of here. I could not begrudge their fear, but I was concerned that it might not be that easy. We really needed all the help we could get looking for the switch, yet they were determined to stay, so we moved on without them. We got back to the town square just in time to find new bodies and scratch marks dotting the area. The man Nicole had spoken with before in the ghost face costume was lying in front of one of the houses with his entire front torn open and large portions of his innards missing. The sight made Nicole and I gag as we discreetly moved past the horrendous sight. The stench of fresh death and the nauseating miasma of torn open and splayed out bodies was almost too much to handle. We moved on and began searching every nook and cranny in the central village for something that looked like a switch. After about 10 minutes of searching, our hearts sank as we heard the town bell being rung again. It sounded further off, like it was in a different section of the mall. We had not moved much further, and so we did not know how much of the mall had been converted into houses to play this sick game. Despite the distance, we did not feel safe, so we hid in the same spot as before and waited until all clear was sounded. I had an idea that was born out of desperation, but I thought of a way we might be able to escape. I looked at the central bonfire still crackling and burning. Then I looked to the skylight and I thought we might be able to escape if we could get up there. I had no idea if we could find the switch in time before we were killed, so any other escape would be welcome. I told Nicole the plan, and we started searching for anything like sections of rope or large ladders we could use, even the crates or something we could stack. The man in the Jedi costume came back into the square and saw what we were doing and offered to help as well. He had a harrowed look on his face, and his prop lightsaber had blood on it. We had stacked some crates and found a length of rope that might reach the top. We would have to find a way to launch the rope up another 10 feet or so. Fortunately, there was a small pipe or fixture available on the roof near the panel, and it was feasible that if we threw the rope up like a lasso, we could catch on to it and climb up and escape through the skylight. I was concerned since I had not done a rope climb since high school gym class, but having my life on the line was a good motivator. We had the loose, lasso-like section at the end of the rope, and after trying and failing to hook the pipe, we succeeded after the 20th try. The man in the Jedi costume, who was named Frank apparently, had volunteered to go first. He gave the rope a strong pull and it held. He grabbed on and hoisted himself up the rope. He was in pretty decent shape since he was making good progress. He was just a few feet from the skylight when we heard a bell ringing from below. We looked down and saw a person standing in front of their door watching us ascend and ringing the bell. We shouted for Frank to hurry up, but we saw something above us that made us all freeze in fear. It was a shadow that was moving on the ceiling, and it climbed into view, obscuring the dim light coming through the skylight. We heard a guttural snarling sound and a snap of gnashing teeth, and suddenly Frank was falling. We all leapt off of the crates and tumbled down to get out of the way. Frank plummeted nearly the entire 28-foot drop from the ceiling. He struck his head on the stacked crates and smashed onto the floor with a horrifying crunch. I had rolled off to the side and broken the worst of my fall. I saw Nicole nearby on her side trying to get to her feet. Frank was motionless, and when I saw the amount of blood pooling near his prone form, I knew he was likely dead. I looked back up and the haze of smoke obscured my vision. Something was still up there blocking the ventilation. I saw the glimmer of yellow eyes regarding me, and I heard a chilling and visceral growl that froze my blood. It was still here, and still haunting us. I moved quickly and tried to get Nicole and help her to her feet, but before I could act, there was an explosion of movement, and I saw a looming shadow on top of my own. I barely had time to throw myself to the side and avoid the crashing form of the creature, as it left a giant dent in the ground where it had landed. In desperation, I managed to pull myself behind the wood panel that was sticking out from one of the houses. I looked back and saw the thing that had been hunting us. It was the first time I had seen it for longer than a brief second, and what I saw was a nightmare made manifest. It had jet black fur that seemed to shift and blend into the darkness itself. Prodigious claws, nearly a foot long, each emerged from the distorted hands of the thing. The face was still shrouded by some impenetrable darkness, except for the piercing yellow eyes that followed every movement of its intended prey with precision. The loud, bestial breathing of the thing was awful, and its breath smelled like death and decay. I had no idea what I was looking at, but the best analogy my fear-addled mind could conjure was a werewolf mixed with pure, hateful shadow. I managed to drop low, and the eyes did not track me by some dumb luck. I breathed a sigh of relief and then a gasp of horror as I remembered Nicole was still out there. I lifted my head as much as I dared to look out into the square and saw the nightmare beast towering over her prone form. I heard her voice cry out and scream, "No!" before it was silenced by a single terrible strike that sprayed the whole area with her blood. It was too much, and I covered my head and huddled there behind the panel, hyperventilating and trying to come up with some plan to survive this. Scott and Nicole were both dead, along with who knows how many other participants. I had to try something. After the all-clear was sounded, I slowly emerged from my hiding spot and saw that Nicole's body was gone. All that remained was a pool of blood. I said a prayer for her and for Scott and left the morbid scene. I was on my own now, but I had to find that switch. I looked at my bag of treasure and sighed dejectedly. Not much use if I die before getting to spend it. The only treasure I needed was to leave this place alive. I moved past the first village and into another section which told a similar tale to the first. Blood and body parts, giant scratches, and sometimes the remains of people's treasure bags. I had an idea and walked up to a door and knocked. A man emerged wearing a plague doctor costume, and I said, "Trick or treat?" He handed me what looked like an uncut diamond, and I would have been thrilled before the reality of this place had been revealed to me. I thanked him and immediately followed up by begging him, "Please, man, if you know where the switch is, tell me. You cannot just sit here and watch us die. I don't know what kind of crazy operation this is, but if you are all involved, then you are complicit in all these murders. Please, you don't have to tell me. Just give me a clue, a direction, something. Just give me a chance." He started to close the door and I considered kicking it in and forcing him to help, but his hand was already on a small silver bell, and I realized I would be signing my own death warrant by doing so. Reluctantly, I left the house and searched around for a different path. I saw something out of the corner of my eye that looked different. It was a small piece of metal sticking out of a wood wall panel. I thought I had found the switch, but instead it seemed to be a door of some sort. It was a wall blocking one of the old entrances to the mall's technical corridors that go behind the stores and connect them. My heart leapt. I thought I had found another way out. I entered the corridor and sealed the way behind me. It was very dark and I could barely see where I was going, but I pressed on. After walking a few minutes, I saw a light ahead and almost let out a cheer of joy when I saw an emergency exit door at the end of the corridor. My relief was short-lived, however. When I pressed the handle and the door held fast, I looked for a lock or something and saw nothing. I pressed harder and then started slamming my shoulder into the door and kicking it. My legs and shoulder were on fire, but I persisted and eventually there was a cracking sound and some give. Several more attempts saw the door swing wide, and I was confused when instead of the outside, it appeared to be another corridor. I rushed on through, and after a few minutes of moving through the hall, I found another door. This one had a crudely written message painted on it. It said, "Aren't you forgetting something?" I opened the door and was confused when I saw a wall leading nowhere on the other side. I looked closer and it was not a solid wall, but another panel. I slid it open and my heart sank. I emerged from a previously unseen section of the entrance corridor, and I stood before the massive gate blocking the entrance, and I felt utterly defeated. The exit had brought me back to the entrance. I looked back at the mocking message and realized there really was only one way out. I paced back and forth near the door. My mind was racing and I was struggling to cope with the fear and hopelessness I felt. As I paced about, I felt something as I stepped down and heard a sickening, squelching noise. I stopped moving and was afraid to look down, but I forced myself to slowly lower my head and I saw the eviscerated remains of the man and woman in the Raggedy Ann and Andy costumes. The silly ragdoll wigs remained, but the larger portions of their heads were missing. Apparently, the area by the door was not safe after all. The bell rang again and I was shocked out of my horror and into action. All I could bring myself to do was flee in a panic back the way I had come. I quickly sealed the panel and door behind me, just as I heard the slavering, growling sound of the beast stalking through the hall. I fled back the other direction and moved past the door I had taken to get into the technical corridor. I was hopeful this direction would lead to somewhere, but I found a dead end. I slumped against the wall and stopped to rest. I knew at that point there was no easy way out. The fear and realization were starting to sink in. I was trapped. There was no choice. I would have to go back in and look for the switch again. I heard the bell through the wall and heard more running and crying, then screaming and death as even more players were picked off by that nightmare creature. I have been sitting here for I don't know how long. It feels like it has been a few hours, but I can't tell for sure. I don't know what to do or how long this will last. I don't think it can get me in here, but if I stay, I can't find the switch and get out. I don't think anyone else is going to get to the switch. I might be the last one left. I don't want to die. I have to try something. There is one area I have not checked upstairs. I thought I saw a strange light coming from a corner near an abandoned area close to the houses up there. I did not have time to check, but that could be it. That could be the switch. I have to find it. I can still get out. I just have to try. I am going to open the door now. The all-clear alarm has sounded, and hopefully I have some time. It's now or never. I step out into the waiting darkness and break into a run.
I'm writing this on a bus, coming home early from a frustrated trip. I can't stop thinking about what happened, and I feel like I need to share it with someone else. This year, a few friends and I decided to take a vacation together and go on a beach trip, planning to stay for about a week. We arranged for everyone to take time off at the same time and rented a house on the coast of a neighboring state. At first, everything went smoothly. I took the bus around 9 p.m. and knowing that the trip would take around 3 hours, I put on my headphones, reclined the seat and enjoyed the view. We agreed to meet at the town's port. At a certain point in the journey, the bus stopped, and the driver informed us he'd be making a brief stop in a town near our final destination. I went to a restaurant, grabbed some coffee and a sandwich, which I barely had time to finish before the bus started moving again. I was dozing off when I felt the bus stop. The driver turned off the engine, the lights came on, and the passengers began to get off. I quickly looked out the window to check that I was in the right place, and after seeing some containers, I got off too. That's when things started to get weird. As soon as I stepped out, I noticed there were no other passengers around, which felt odd since it had been barely 20 seconds since everyone had disembarked. The place I was standing in was just part of the road. It didn't even look like a bus stop, much less the port and bus station that my friends had mentioned earlier. The only sign of life nearby was a gate with a guard booth and, inside, a collection of containers and cranes that looked like a shipping company. When I tried to get back on the bus, to ask the driver if I hadn't gotten off at the wrong stop, he had already left. I looked at my phone, paused the music, and checked the time. Midnight sharp. I called one of my friends to let them know I had arrived, hoping that this was the right place. No answer. I only managed to send a quick message, "I think I'm at the port," before my battery died. Apparently listening to music for 3 hours straight was just too much for my old phone. With no idea what else to do, I approached the guard booth to ask for information. Inside was a woman, who smiled when she saw me approaching. I asked her if I was in the right place and explained a little bit of the situation. "Ah, the port? Oh, no, you're far away. About 5 miles, I believe, my dear," she replied with a big smile and a voice a little strange. I can't explain it, but the woman seemed off. Her skin looked different, in a way that I couldn't tell whether she was 26 or 62, and her voice didn't sound natural. At the time, I didn't pay much attention to any of this, but in retrospect, it seemed as if she wasn't human, but something trying to be human. "But if you want, you can go through here. James and I will take you to the port. Everything will be fine," she said while gesturing to a colleague who was near the gate. I hadn't noticed the colleague before. In fact, it's as if he appeared out of nowhere as soon as she called him. He came towards me with the same huge smile and strange skin. For some reason, that gave me chills. Those two looking at me, piercing me with their eyes and with that sinister smile almost drooling, as if I were a dish from a 5-star restaurant. Something told me to not wait for this James guy to approach, so I walked away, muttering a goodbye. I couldn't see much ahead, just the road and the silhouette of vegetation on both sides of the asphalt. There were no streetlights except one in front of the company, and likely none for the next 5 miles. I started walking, but I soon realized that it would be a long trek, so I raised my thumb in hope that someone passing by would give me a ride, and it didn't take long for a truck driver to pull up next to me. I got close to his window and, to my surprise, he didn't look right either. He was an older man, or at least I think it was because of his white hair, but he had the same strange skin as the woman and James I just met. He invited me into the truck, saying he would take me to the port in no time. Strange, because I hadn't even told him where I wanted to go. Come on, kid. I'll take you there. You won't even notice. You can sleep if you're tired. Everything will be fine, the old man insisted. He spoke in the same strange, weirdly broken way as the other two. The chill I had felt before now intensified, and it went up my spine like an electric shock. I didn't even bother to say something to the truck driver. I just moved on, quickening my pace. He just stood there. From then on, I started to walk faster. I had a weird feeling as if things weren't right, and what scared me the most, that something was watching me. I rounded a bend in the road and saw a broken guardrail and a crashed car beyond it. It looked like the accident had happened some time ago, but obviously, the scene didn't help with my anxiety at all. The further I got, the more unsettling this place became. The air grew heavy and I started to hear noises in the vegetation. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I was getting exhausted from the walk, and my eyes were strained from trying to see in the pitch dark. After about 2 hours of walking just past another curve, this time forming a big S along with the previous one, a car stopped next to me. It was an old hatchback, probably from the 90s. I couldn't see much, but the car looked run down. At this point, I was obviously no longer hitchhiking, and my paranoia made me completely suspicious of whoever the driver was. And with good reason. "Get in, Alex. I'll take you to the port," he said calmly. "How do you know my name?" I shouted, desperate. "What do you mean, Alex? We all know your name. We just want to help you. Trust us. Everything will be fine," he replied, lifting his head and looking directly at me with the same massive, twisted smile as the others. Taking a good look at his face, he looked almost identical to the truck driver, like twins, both equally disfigured and weird. This time, I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, without even looking back to see if anything was following me. I must have ran for another 2 hours until exhaustion took over, and I sat down on the roadside. Everything seemed quiet and safe. Too safe. I opened my backpack to take the last sip from my water bottle when I began to hear them. Voices coming from the bushes next to me. At first, I couldn't make out what they were saying, but slowly I began to recognize my name being called. "Alex. Alex, come this way. Alex, it's a shortcut. Alex, everything will be fine, Alex." The feeling of safety soon turned to horror, and I went back running. The voices grew louder, more distorted, and when I inevitably looked back, my fears were confirmed. There was a man... No. A creature chasing me. It was humanoid, but with disproportionate limbs and a bizarre skin, as if it were imitating human skin, which writhed and twisted, and it was smiling at me. That thing came closer, initially walking slowly, but picking up its pace towards me. I ran awkwardly, totally consumed by fear, crying and screaming, the creature chasing, obviously faster than me. At one point getting close enough to touch me, and it did. It put its hand, bony and cold, on my shoulder. As I fumbled to get away from its grasp, I tripped and went rolling. The thing came after me, opening its mouth, revealing rotten and missing teeth, kneeling down in my direction. I've never been a fighter, but at that time, some kind of instinct came over me. Somehow I felt this would be my last seconds alive if I didn't try to fight it. So I kicked, punched, did everything I could to get away. After a few blows to its head, the creature seemed to recoil for a second, looking at me with a twisted and broken smile mixed with an expression of confusion, as if it didn't believe that I could defend myself like that. To be honest, I didn't believe it either. But that single moment was enough for me to get up on my feet and start running again. I soon encountered the first streetlight in what felt like years. As I got closer, I saw the sea, containers, docked ships, a lighthouse in the distance, and a small group of people. It was the port. I stopped running, but was still paranoid and anxious, so I avoided contact with anyone. Looking behind me, at first I saw nothing besides the darkness of that god-forsaken road, but squinting my eyes, I could barely see that pale figure, standing still, staring directly at me. For some reason it had given up on chasing me after I entered the light. Then I saw the bus arrive, and exactly the same passengers who were with me got off. Soon I also saw my friends approaching. They were drinking and laughing, and when they saw me they ran over, shouting and cheering to celebrate my arrival. One of them tried to talk to me, asking me why I was looking terrible, sweating, dirty, and shaking. I just lit a cigarette, walked with them to the house a few blocks away, and told them that I was extremely tired and needed some sleep. When I got there, I left my things in my room, plugged in my phone to charge, and went to take a shower. There was a clock in the hallway, and, giving me one last moment of terror, it showed 12:05. The next day, my friends woke me up, asking about what had happened the night before, and why I seemed so scared. I tried to tell the story, but obviously no one believed it. Some said I was lying, or that I was smoking some really good stuff. I even opened Google Maps to show where that company was, where everything had supposedly happened, but to my surprise, I couldn't find it. There was no S-curve on the road. In fact, the road between the town where I stopped to eat and the port of the town we were in was completely straight, well lit, and without companies, gates, or containers. There was even a gas station halfway through, which I sure as crap didn't see last night. Amid all the jokes and questions, one of the people in the room, who I didn't really know, approached me and said, "Relax, Alex. I think you just had a weird dream. You're with us now. Everything will be fine." He broke into a giant smile as he said those last words in a distorted way. At that moment, I ran up the stairs, grabbed my backpack, and went straight to the port to wait for the next bus. Without saying anything to anyone. I used to live in the middle of backwoods Pennsylvania, near a set of train tracks that ran through the woods. About once, maybe twice a week, I would hear the cry of a train horn splitting the air. Always at a different time, but usually in the early morning or late evening. Sometimes it would even wake me from a deep sleep in the middle of the night. The little house I was renting was nice, at the very end of the cul-de-sac I lived in, and nestled back against a copse of trees. I wasn't entirely sure where the train tracks were, since they didn't run through town anywhere, but every time I was startled by the piercing cry, I thought it sounded like it was coming from the woods. The longer I lived in that little house, the more curious I got about the train. It probably sounds silly, but I've always liked trains. And even though I found the train horn startling, it was comforting in a weird way too. Every time it sounded, my ears would perk up, and I would find myself tracing the sound as it moved, trying to pinpoint exactly where it came from and where it was going to. Finally, after about a year of that, I decided to take one of my days off and go look for the train tracks. I put a few bottles of water and some snacks in a backpack, put on my favorite pair of walking shoes, and practically skipped out the front door. It reminded me of being a kid. I didn't have the best home life, so it wasn't uncommon for me to pack a bag with enough provisions and comic books for the day before disappearing into the woods near our house. The woods were my escape, a place where I was safe from anger, yelling, and whatever my parents were throwing at each other that day. The forest was always calm and quiet. It made me feel safe, a feeling I couldn't always get from home. As I walked out my back door, I was reminded of that and how much I loved going for those walks as a kid. I'll admit, I think I was expecting it to feel just as safe and magical now, but I was wrong.
The forest itself was perfect. Silence punctuated only by the occasional bird call or rustle of the leaves brushing each other in the wind. It was an early spring day and earth was spongy from recent rainfall. Dew dripped lazily from the green trees and sparkled on the tall grass as I walked through it. I made my way in the approximate direction I heard the train horn coming from. No real plan in mind for when I found it, just enjoying the breeze as it played with my hair. After about an hour, I finally found the train tracks and let out an excited whoop when they came into view. I raced forward like a little kid until I got right next to them. Then I began walking parallel to the tracks, towards the mountains in the distance. My parents had always told me not to walk near train tracks, but I always wanted to follow them just once to see where I wound up. I followed the train tracks with a spring in my step, not noticing the sun sinking lower in the sky until the shadows grew long enough in front of me to blend together into one big pool of shadow. When I realized the sun was starting to go down, I stopped. I had been so lost in my thoughts, and in finally fulfilling a childhood dream, that I hadn't realized how late it was. I turned around and followed the train tracks, now at a quicker pace, until I reached the area I thought I had started from. I was still following the tracks when a figure emerged from the twilight on the path in front of me. I couldn't make out any details, but it seemed to be entirely gray, like a smudge of ash on the horizon growing steadily larger. Something about it really unsettled me, which I attributed to being a woman walking alone at night and seeing a stranger approach in the twilight. I veered off the tracks and made my way through the woods, emerging one neighborhood over from my own, and followed the streets back to my house, exhausted by the time I finally got there. I guess the stranger I saw on the tracks just left my mind. I didn't think about it at all for the rest of the night, and by the time I woke up the next day, I didn't even remember the vaguely unsettling encounter. It was a few weeks before I was able to make it back into the woods, but once another lazy day off came around, I packed my bag and escaped out the back door again. This time I left a bit earlier and went the other direction, towards what I assumed would be town, or maybe the next town over. I figured if I wandered to the next town by accident, I could always take a taxi home. This was before Uber was very popular. This time I took a can of spray paint and made a huge blue X on one of the trees that I could see from the tracks, so I would know where to head back into the woods to get home. I can't say for sure, but that decision might have saved my life. Again, time seemed to escape me, and before I knew it, it was late afternoon. I turned myself around and once again saw a smudge on the distant horizon, slowly approaching me and taking shape. This time there was enough light that I assumed it would be fine, probably just another person wandering the train tracks to fill their empty Sunday afternoon. I kept walking, studying the trees surrounding the tracks on either side, and admiring the giant purple mountains in front of me. I was startled from my reverie to realize that what had been nothing more than a smudge the last time I looked was now a person, just a few hundred yards away at most. I studied him as I approached. He seemed to be wearing a gray three-piece suit and gray shoes. His hair was gray too. He carried some kind of bag. It looked like a white trash bag, like one of the really heavy-duty ones, and it almost looked like it was filled with a liquid. It heaved and sagged, even though he carried it with such ease it could have been full of helium. I'll admit, I didn't find him terrifying at first. It was a lovely afternoon. I was enjoying myself, and I've always been a really friendly person, so it was actually kind of excited that I might get to meet one of my neighbors out on my little walk. But when we were close enough for me to greet him, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. It was like my senses shut down, and the only thing I was left with was this awful feeling of complete and total revulsion. Despite my vision going gray around the edges, I
forced myself to keep walking, to get past the mystery person and closer to home. When we were right next to each other, all my senses returned to normal, and I noticed with a pang of fear and concern that even the man's skin was an ashy shade of gray. He continued to face forward, but his face seemed to melt and twist in my direction. All the features remained clear, but it was like the skin behind his face was melting, allowing the face itself to slip in my direction. He smiled at me, flashing gray teeth and the corner of a gray tongue peeking out of his mouth. Then he passed me and I took a huge gulp of air, trying to calm my rioting stomach and nerves. Despite how badly I wanted to collapse to the earth and sob from whatever that was, I forced myself to keep walking. Now more than ever, I just wanted to get home. After a few more minutes of walking, I managed to convince myself I had just imagined it. Or maybe the man had some kind of medical condition, and I was being unfair to judge him so harshly. As I successfully guilt-tripped myself into brushing off the weirdness, I noticed something on the horizon. A gray smudge that seemed to be getting closer to me. I debated it for a moment, then allowed myself to stop and turn around. There was nothing behind me. No traces of the strange gray man. I turned back around and somehow he had managed to clear almost all the distance between us, in the time it took me to turn around and back. I forced myself to keep walking, insisting to my now terrified brain that it was a coincidence, or I had spaced out for longer than I realized. As I got closer to the man, I forced a smile onto my own face, and with every ounce of courage I had asked, "Hey there, didn't we just see each other?" The look on his face didn't alter in the slightest, and neither did his stride as he approached. His mouth opened and a voice as gray as a tombstone said, "We'll be seeing a lot of each other." The smile on his face stayed in place as mine faltered and crashed, and I picked up my pace to get past him as quickly as possible. As I did, a scent I hadn't noticed before wafted from his trash bag to my nose, and I had to resist the need. It was more than an urge to vomit. What I smelled can only be described as death, plain and simple. It assaulted my nostrils and filled my mind with images of death and destruction, things I could never have pictured on my own. War-torn battlefields scattered with the flesh and blood of innocent people, bodies torn apart by animals, corpses swaying in the breeze, glassy eyes still begging for a savior even though it was far too late. I gasped, pressing my hands to my mouth and nose, and hurried away. After a few minutes, the smell was gone, but the images and nausea remained. I couldn't understand what was wrong with me. And more than anything, I just wanted to get home, to safety and my comfiest chair, but I was still at least an hour away from my house. I glanced behind me again, let out a sigh of relief when I saw the gray man still walking away from me, then bit my tongue so hard I drew blood when I turned back and saw another gray smudge on the horizon. I whipped my head around again and saw he had disappeared. With resignation to my fate, I turned back around, already knowing what would be in front of me. Sure enough, the gray man, with the gray smile, was once again a few hundred yards in front of me. I bit back a little sob and looked around, wondering if I could get away from him somehow. Most of the area between the tracks and the trees was filled with grass and weeds that would go up at least to my waist. I would have been fine with that, except I'm terrified of ticks, and didn't want to risk taking one home with me. As the stranger approached in the distance, I weighed my options. Pass the creepy old guy again, or risk getting a parasite. It was a hard choice, but I finally took a deep breath and plunged into the tall grass. I glanced over at the tracks, almost against my will, and breathed a sigh of relief. He wasn't there. He must have done his little disappearing trick when I stepped off the tracks. I smiled in relief and face front again, my heart shattering into violent little shards in my chest as I jumped backwards and to the side. He was directly in front of me again, with that same carved from stone, gray-toothed smile. He continued walking forward, eyes on the horizon, fists clenched around the trash bag in his hand. I stopped moving and simply stared at him as he passed, begging my mind to make sense of what was happening. Something in the bag sloshed, and the smell of blood and death overwhelmed me, making me feel sick all over again. I pressed my hands into my eyes, but when I opened them, the gray man was still there, walking away from me, his pace the same as ever. I forced myself to root to the spot and watch him walk away. I waited until the shadows grew longer and he was once again just a gray smudge on the horizon. When I turned back around, I was angry but not surprised to see the gray smear in front of me again. I sighed and continued walking, telling myself it was a coincidence or I was imagining things. But as he came back into focus, a distant part of my mind screamed that I was in danger. I made the mistake of shoving that voice and its wisdom to the back of my mind. I had to get home. I didn't want to walk in the tall grass and risk getting a tick, and the gray man was going to be there no matter what I did, so I might as well follow the tracks until I made it back home. This time when the gray man got closer, the smell was the first thing that greeted me. I choked down my vomit and blinked tears from my eyes as I took a deep breath and held it. When the man was about 10 feet from me, something in his smile changed. He didn't move exactly, but his lower jaw seemed to grow, as if the hinges of his jaw were melting and allowing his face to sink lower and lower. For the first time, his eyes met mine, and I knew I had made a horrible mistake. By the time he passed me, his jaw was down to his chest, but his eyes had never left mine. Once he was behind me, I began sprinting, only interested in getting home before it was completely dark. Up ahead, I could see the bright blue X I had spray painted on the tree, and I veered away from the tracks again, now running through the grass with no other thought in mind than getting back home. But as I ran, my vision began to blur slightly. The shadows of the trees turned gray and seemed to take on more form. Something gray appeared right in front of the tree I had painted on, slowly morphing into a gray man walking towards me, trash bags swinging from his hand. I halted, waited until he was a few feet from me, then bolted to the side into the tree line. I crashed through the trees wildly, paying attention to nothing except the gray smudges that would appear in front of me, taking shape into the man more rapidly each time. By the time I saw my house in the distance, the gray man was practically running alongside me, smile still carved into his face, bag still swinging in his hand, liquid and whatever else it contains sloshing around inside. I made it inside and locked the doors and windows, but outside I could still see the two pale shadows lurking, taking on the form of a man before disappearing again. I left Pennsylvania not long after that. It lost all its charm for me, but when I lay down in bed at night, all I can see when I close my eyes is the gray man, off in the distance. He gets closer every night, and I know someday he'll catch me.
It all started when I woke up in the middle of the night and found a strange, suffocating weight on my chest, like someone was sitting on me. I could make out an outline of someone's figure above me, their back outlined by the orange light from the street lamps seeping through the window. I tried to scream for help, or turn my head to look at my husband, but I couldn't move. I didn't regain control of my body until after the weight had lifted, and I heard a deep male grunt from a man pulling himself off me. I heard his footsteps too. I saw his silhouette leave through the door, and it was only hours later of laying in that same position that I felt I could move again. It started with a pin-pricking sensation through my toes and fingers, then spread through my entire body, like the feeling you get when your leg falls asleep and you have to wake it back up. I immediately went to my husband and shook him awake. He was distraught and confused, asking me to slow down, to tell him what happened. He was so scared by my hysterics, he was moved to tears. Even still, he didn't believe me. He said he was right next to me. He'd have woken up if someone came inside our room. He assured me it was all a dream and rubbed my back to soothe me until I could fall back asleep. But a week later, the same paralysis came for me. It was after an argument with my husband over finances. The same terror, the same feeling of someone sitting on my chest, then getting up and leaving the room. This time I saw something in their hand. A knife? I couldn't know. It was far too dark. My husband again told me it was just a bad dream, that I couldn't afford to keep stressing myself out so much over money. Ever since I lost my job, we've been struggling to make rent. My husband keeps telling me he'll take care of it. He'll take care of us. I think that's some weird masculine BS from his time. He's 43. I'm 26. That's the other problem with all this. I'm pregnant. 5 months around this time. The financial strain had been weighing on my psyche and causing me so much stress that I'd resorted to my own means of making money for us, since I couldn't find another job. I'd been participating in paid clinical trials in order to make ends meet for us. My husband never asked where the extra money was coming from. He had no idea. He's always been so protective over me. He would have died knowing I was selling my body to Big Pharma. It was a clinical drug trial for preeclampsia, and all they did was give me a small pill, take my blood and my vitals, and send me on my way once a week. Maybe the pills were causing these sleep paralysis episodes. I wasn't sure, but I could never confide in my husband about it. Anyway, a week ago I went over to my neighbor's house with my husband for a little Halloween party. My neighbors Sarah, 40 female, and Tom, 40 male, are both so sweet. They left baked goods on our porch every Saturday since I announced my pregnancy. Sarah checked in on me almost daily, texting me, asking me how I am, how I'm feeling, if I'm having any morning sickness. Their kindness makes this whole thing all the stranger. At the Halloween party, I asked Sarah for a soda. Everyone else was having beer, but, you know. She told me they have some in her outside fridge, down the stairs in the unfinished basement/garage. So I headed away from the party, fumbled for the string light, and made my way down the creaky wooden steps to the basement. The floor was concrete and cold on my bare feet, so I tiptoed past Tom's latest mechanical mess to the kitchenette and old, rusted white fridge in the far corner. The first thing I noticed here was a red splatter of what looked to be blood on the inside of the wash basin. There were power tools and saws and such down there, as the basement is also Tom's workshop. He could have cut his finger, washed his hands, and not the sink. I shrugged it off and opened the fridge. I was immediately hit with a strange whiff of iron as I swung the door open. There were at least 3 dozen milk cartons coating the shelves inside, with 2 Sprites on the fridge door. I didn't know what compelled me then to reach for the milk. Maybe I was really thirsty for it. Some pregnancy craving. Maybe I knew something was wrong. I had some intuition about it. But I grabbed a carton. It was heavy and the liquid inside didn't slosh the way I expected it to. It sounds strange, like something you wouldn't be able to notice, but I did. I placed it down on the single countertop on the kitchenette, found a glass in the top shelf of the cabinet above, unscrewed the cap of the milk carton, and began to pour. What came out wasn't milk. It was red. It was blood. I vomited in the sink. Tom must have heard me, or knew I was digging where I shouldn't have been. He came down and held back my hair while I emptied my stomach, whispering calm words like easing a brood mare. He called down my husband, who took me back upstairs. He threw my coat over my shoulders and talked quietly with Tom and Sarah by the door. "She'll be fine. Just scared is all. No worries. Thank you, yes." I stood there with nothing to say, eyes wide, unsure of what to make of it all. My first ridiculous thought was that Tom and Sarah were vampires. It wasn't until we were walking back across the street to our house that I was able to ask Tom, "What was that?" Tom looked at me strangely, his brow furrowed. "Why are you poking around where you shouldn't be?" "Are you serious? They had blood in their milk cartons." Tom sighed, pulled away from me. He was obviously frustrated. "They own a farm, Liv." "Okay." "You don't know how slaughtering an animal works, do you?" He was so angry. I could see his hands bunched into fists, shaking slightly. "What are you talking about?" "They drain the pigs of blood after slaughter." I chewed on this, shaking my head. Both of us standing at odds with each other in the middle of the road. "So are you trying to tell me they've filled milk cartons with pig's blood?" "Yes." "Why would they do that?" "Because it's a thickening agent. High in protein. It's used in a wide variety of dishes. You've probably eaten it before and haven't even known it." I stared at my husband indignantly, feeling shame rising up in me. The last thing I wanted to do was apologize. But here I was, saying sorry in the middle of the street, just to get us back inside the house. My sleep paralysis stopped for a few months after. At my 7th month of pregnancy, it started again. Once a week, usually Sunday nights. I would take my prenatal vitamins before bed and wake up around midnight to find it almost impossible to breathe. At this point, I was no longer sleeping on my back. I was sleeping on my side. Still, the sleep paralysis demon, or man, would straddle my shoulders, his back rising above me like a mountain so I couldn't see anything but the bottom of his feet. Bare, black soles, long toenails that scraped against the sheets, dirty jeans. Sure enough, it should have been a dream. But one night I woke, crying once again, and after I settled I found dirt rubbed off on the white pillowcase by my head, a deep red stain on the bed. That same morning in the shower, I checked myself for any hints of damage. When I was paralyzed like that, I couldn't feel a thing except the relentless weight on top of me, the inability to fully breathe. The only injuries on me were the bruises on the inside of my elbows on both sides, right where I had weekly blood draws at the clinical trial. The clinical trial my husband still didn't know about, though he should have seen the discoloration on my arms when we had sex, which now was more and more frequent. Leading up to my birth, my husband's behavior toward me became even stranger. He worried incessantly over me, taking me to sleep trials which revealed no abnormalities, arguing with doctors that something was wrong, describing my dizziness, my fatigue, the bruising on my arms. The first time I realized he'd noticed. The doctor said this was all normal for someone during pregnancy, especially nearing the end. I remember at the end of my 7th month of pregnancy, I again had a bout of sleep paralysis. This time during it, I swear I could hear my husband crying softly. It was hard to make out over the grunts and heavy breathing above me. I asked him over breakfast what he'd been crying about. He was very, very quiet, and told me only that he had a bad dream that I was being hurt. Maybe, at the time, I thought my paranoia a problem. Either way, I obeyed it. I no longer trusted my husband, nor did I trust my neighbors, even my own parents. I stopped eating any food anyone made for me, and cooked only for myself. I lost weight, became even paler and weaker than before. I stopped attending the clinical trials, and my husband came home with more money, having recently gotten a promotion I didn't believe, as he clocked out of work hours early every day to come check up on me. Except, strangest of all, my sleep paralysis stopped completely. Instead, I slept dreamless, and it was nearly impossible to wake me. I slept for 12, 13 hours at a time without waking up once. One morning in the shower, weeks after I'd stopped attending the clinical trials and getting regular blood draws, I found strange bruising over my inner elbow, a small pinprick over the vein. In the dark, I hadn't been able to see the lack or presence of bruising, but under the bathroom lights, it was there. I confronted my husband about it. He said I probably injured myself somehow. I should go get checked out. I shouldn't be bruising so easily. I told him that it looked like a needle wound, traced the vein's blueness. He looked at me so strangely. Then his phone rang, and he disappeared into the bedroom. My suspicions had grown intense. Something was wrong. No more sleep paralysis, sure, but someone was visiting me in the night still. I knew it. A few weeks before my due date, I didn't take my prenatal vitamins. It was a Monday. It was midnight, and I was pretending to sleep. I didn't feel the usual unrelenting fatigue I did late in the evening. But still, awake, I saw him come in. I closed my eyes quick, heard his heavy breathing over me. Then he pulled the bedsheet over my face, whispered in a rough voice, "All right, girl." I recognized that voice. He reached under the blankets, his hand brushing mine above the mattress. I made a small noise of fear, flinched away. He froze. Then he put a hand on my shoulder, moved the bedsheet away from my face, and even though my eyes were closed, I could feel him studying me, watching me. Once I calmed myself, he continued, taking my wrist in his hand and holding the inside with his 2 fingers. He was wearing gloves, nitrile, and he was taking my pulse, I realized, counting to a minute, the longest minute of my life. Then he placed a hand on my belly, and it took everything in me not to scream. Something cold replaced his fingers, and he held it there. My stomach churned and my baby reared up inside me. I was going to throw up. No, I couldn't. "That's it," he whispered to me, to no one. I realized then how I recognized the voice. Tom. It sounded just like Tom. That was all I could take. I jolted out of my sleep and upright, my eyes meeting his in the dark. Sure enough, Tom was staring back at me. I screamed at him and he raised his gloved hand. There was a stethoscope around his neck, like he was cosplaying a doctor. My husband shot up from the other side of the bed. For a moment, him and Tom just stared at each other. Then my husband raised his voice in a way I'd never heard before. "Get out! Get out!" Tom shot out of the room quicker than I could process. My husband chased him out, his shouts and threats echoing through the house. When he came back, I told him we should call the cops. He said no, that wasn't a good idea. He would deal with it. He took a bat from underneath the bed and headed out with it. I tried to stop him, but he left out the front door and didn't return till the next morning. By then, I'd found the milk carton laying on its side by my fallen bed sheets, a plastic funnel on the ground next to it. I felt sick, so sick to think about all that blood in Tom's fridge. My blood. I went to the bathroom and emptied my stomach till I couldn't anymore. When my husband came home, he told me he'd taken care of it. There was blood splattered on his face and the bat. He washed it off in the kitchen sink. I was silent, at a loss for words. Afterward, I watched him put locks on all the doors, draw the shades, and set the alarms. "Did you kill him?" I asked. My husband just shook his head no. As he locked our bedroom window, he said, "Just be safe, okay?" For the rest of the day, we cooped ourselves up inside watching movies, taking it easy, as he put it, laying low. I asked him what Tom would want with cartons of blood. My husband looked wildly uncomfortable, said that men are scary. It could have been anything. Could have been selling it on the dark web. That stuff makes a lot of money, supposedly. He kissed my forehead and pulled me close. I asked him for the second time then if we should call the police. He didn't reply. Over the next week, he told me I needed to stay home, that he'd go out for groceries, meds, etc. Almost my entire pregnancy he'd been pushing for a home birth, but now he was adamant about it. Meanwhile, I was having second thoughts. What if something went wrong? What if Tom came by? Whenever I shared these concerns with my husband, he got angry. Eventually, after a heated argument, I asked him if he planned to keep me cooped up like a dog till I gave birth or died. He just glared at me. I said I was going to leave for a little while, give him some time to work through things. As soon as I did, he grabbed me by the arm and begged me to stay. He burst into tears, saying that everything he did for me. That he was sorry for how he'd been treating me, how he'd scared me, but he was scared. God, he was scared. He asked me to stay with him. So I did. When he went to take a shower that night, I again checked our bedroom for anything Tom might have left behind. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Nothing on the floor, of course. It had been a week after all. I would have tripped over anything left over. But under the bed was a spool of rope, cable ties, duct tape. My husband and I had never participated in bondage or anything of the sort. That was my final straw. I had a horrible, horrible feeling. I called my mom and asked her if I could come over. She said of course. I tried to go out the front door, but it was locked from the inside. I didn't even know that was possible. I tried the back door, locked again. At this point I was so panicked I started to cry. I checked the kitchen window. Locked. Finally, the giant office window was open. 8 months pregnant. I hauled my butt out the window and dropped 5 feet into the garden. And I ran, caught an Uber, and made my way to my mom's place. I've been here 2 days now. I have endless missed calls from my husband. I don't know what to say to him. I'm not sure if I think he's just paranoid or if he's somehow a part of this whole thing with Tom. What should I do? Should I go back home? I don't want to give birth without my husband, but he's scaring me. Tom is a whole other problem I'm too afraid to fully confront. I'm thinking of going back home tomorrow and explaining myself to my husband, getting answers to the questions that have been plaguing me, and leaving if I need to. I don't want to do anything too drastic, like call off the marriage before I know the whole story, but I guess I'm afraid to know what the real story is. What do you think? Should I try and fix things before I give birth? Should I call the police? Back over the 4th of July, my family all got together at my parents' house. And while I was over there, my mom told me that she and my dad were remodeling their basement and asked me to get the rest of my stuff out. And as a quick side note, I'm going to change or omit my kids' names for privacy, but didn't think it much mattered with everyone else for reasons you'll understand later. I'm 39 and haven't lived there in years, and had a handful of old belongings that I'd never bothered to take with me. Mostly old things from my childhood that I didn't have much need for, and held sentimental value, like a few favorite dolls and stuffed animals, old art projects and the like. Thankfully, my mom had it all in storage containers for years, making it easy to grab a few and take home with me. My sister Nat and her family live out of state, and were staying at my parents' through the weekend, and my kids had their cousin, Nat's daughter, Big Z, it's a nickname, stay at our house the following night since it was Friday. Looking for something to keep the kids busy that night and feeling nostalgic, I went digging through the storage bins I'd taken home with me and found some old VHS tapes with haphazardly made labels reading things like The News with Lizzie at 5 and Primetime Update. When we were kids, my sisters Nat, the youngest, Steffi, the middle, and I, the oldest, used to have a blast making home videos, and our favorite subject by a mile was to create news shows with an anchor and then cut to different reporters on scene, covering stories consisting of either sensational events acted with our toys, human interest stories of us showing off our childish talents and hobbies, or ambush interviews and coverage of our parents and their friends. And one time, the pizza man, who in hindsight was a pretty good sport about it. The subject matter, more often than not, was not only ridiculous but also rather morbid, or at least grotesque, since vampire Cabbage Patch Kids attacking pet rabbits was much more fun and imaginative than more realistic news. This seemed like a perfect opportunity to show my kids and my niece what their moms got up to when we were their age. Well, I took a walk down memory lane at the expense of my husband cracking jokes and never letting me live it down. I randomly grabbed one of the tapes and gathered everyone in the basement where we still have an old DVD/VHS combo player hooked up for the kids to watch old DVDs on occasion. After a minute or two of messing with the tracking and making sure the component cables were in their right spots, I got the tape playing to see my 8 or so year old self sitting at a little blue and yellow plastic table with a notebook and pencil in hand, and giant glasses from the 70s on, trying my darndest to look like a serious and sober news anchor. 8-year-old me had hardly gotten through saying, "Welcome to Lizzie's News tonight," when my husband, oozing sarcasm, said, "So exciting, I better go make popcorn," and got up to head upstairs before adding, "See kids, Mom looked like a lollipop with her giant head on a tiny body too." The kids and I watched through the first segment, featuring me reporting on the amazing Steffi, a magician who was going to saw Nat in half inside a cardboard refrigerator box, using a plastic toy saw. Nat, wearing her favorite Discovery Channel tee that she would never grow into, climbed inside the box, sticking her head out one end, while what were supposed to be her legs emerged out the other side. As I watched, it crossed my mind that I had no idea whose legs those were. I know we occasionally would make these movies with friends and other neighborhood kids, but couldn't remember who would have been with us by themselves, since all of our friends would come with their siblings, or whose legs would have been close enough to match Tiny Nat's. Looking closely, I also noticed something that initially seemed curious, but came to feel deeply disturbing. That pair of legs also didn't seem to look quite right. It was hard to tell since they were only visible below the knee, but they seemed to bend the wrong way, were a bit too grayish for healthy skin tone, and the overall shape and curvature just wasn't quite right. For the time being, I shrugged it off, chalking it up to poor VHS image fidelity, and made a mental note to go back and show my husband when the kids weren't watching. By the time the segment was over, the kids had already began to get distracted with other things, and grown bored of the 4 minutes of old video. So I turned it off, and we went on with our night. Later, after the kids were asleep, and my husband was upstairs entranced with his video games and giving me that "do not disturb" on penalty of death vibe, I got the urge to go watch some more. After another few news segments, of which the only real value is in sentiment to me and my sisters, so I won't bore you by recounting them. My 8-year-old self cut into her own report with breaking news about a tragic accident that had taken place. The hair on my neck raised a bit as the tone of this segment took a turn, like a dark pull had come over us, and even though we appeared as though we were outwardly having fun making the video, we were emptily going through the motions. Something just felt off. I was playing the reporter again, on the scene in our room, covering the tragic story of a little girl gone missing. Steffi played the distressed sister, who explained that they missed her so much, and that after everyone and the police had searched for days, they were alerted by a really, really gross smell to discover that the girl, played by Nat, had fallen backwards off the top bunk, breaking her neck and getting lodged between the wall and the lower bunk. And while Steffi sat up on the bed holding her nose from the stench, I brought the camera over to show Nat curled up awkwardly upside down between the bed and the wall, pretending to be dead. This shocked me, to say the least. I certainly don't remember every little video we made, but I have a vague recollection of a lot of them, and even though we often enacted macabre stories, even involving someone dying, this felt outside our realm. Having had enough at that point, I turned off the TV and called it a night. The next morning I heard the kids awake much earlier than I'd have liked, but wasn't too surprised given the sleepover, and reminded myself to be thankful that at least it was Saturday, and popped my head in to say good morning and see what they wanted me to make for breakfast, since it was a special morning with their cousin here. I opened the door and said, "Good morning, rise and shine," with my biggest, kid-patronizing smile, to find my kids horsing around together on the bed, and then immediately noticed something odd. "Where's Bigsy?" "Right here," my youngest daughter exclaimed, grabbing her pink dinosaur stuffed animal and proudly holding it up. I played along. "Oh my, you look quite unwell this morning, Bigsy. Maybe you need some breakfast." But while the youngest laughed, the older two gave me a confused look. I closed the door and let them be for a few minutes, figuring it was better to let their game run its course. But when I came back, they still seemed to be at it. "Okay, enough fun, but we need to have some breakfast and get Bigsy back over to Nana and Nano's, and Auntie Nat." My youngest laughed again and said something like, No, Bigsy lives here." But the other two seemed suddenly concerned. "I don't get it," said my oldest. "Get what?" I said, now confused myself. "Who's Auntie Nat?" The whole room went cold, like the curtains had suddenly been drawn, and I immediately switched to serious mom mode. "Okay, it's not funny anymore. Where is Bigsy hiding?" "Right there," said my oldest, pointing to the stuffed dinosaur, and looking alarmingly earnest. "Stop it now, or no fireworks tonight." "But that's Bigsy." "I'm serious. I will go get your dad," I said sternly, but was more frightened than angry. The youngest had started crying, and tears were welling up in the other two. "That is, Mom, I swear. I don't know what you want me to say. What did we do?" Everyone swore they had no idea who Bigsy was, and I turned the house inside out trying to find her. At first I thought maybe my husband got the kids to play a very unfunny prank on me, because that is totally something he would do. But after angrily arguing with he and the kids for a half hour about it, I called Nat but got no answer. So I tried my mom and dad. They claimed not to remember Bigsy either, and when I got frustrated and asked how on earth they couldn't remember Nat's kid, they hung up on me. I called Steffi, who I knew wouldn't ever have participated in this obnoxious joke, and was momentarily relieved to hear her say, "Of course, I know Bigsy." Oh, thank God. I thought I was losing my mind. And then when Nat wouldn't answer her phone, I thought I was going to fall to pieces.
Okay, that's not funny, Liz, Steffi said, suddenly very serious. What? I responded, confused. Don't ever say something like that again. Like what? I said incredulously. Yeah, I'm done with this conversation, Steffi said and hung up. Ignoring her for the moment, and more than a little annoyed, I walked into the other room to triumphantly gloat to my husband that Steffi confirmed Bigsy, and I'd had enough of the stupid joke, so she could come out from wherever she's been hiding now. Steffi remembers Bigsy, and is on my side and doesn't think the joke was funny. You're so mean. Well, of course she is. Whatever. Seriously now, though, we need to get Bigsy back to my parents or Nat will be mad, since they have to drive home today. We don't have time for this anymore. Wow. Who's the one making unfunny jokes now? He said with added condescension. I don't get it. What do you mean? What do you mean? Bringing your sister that died when you were little into this. That's not something even I would joke about. It has been months now. No one remembers Bigsy as anyone other than my daughter's pink dinosaur. I can't find any evidence of my sister Nat, and everyone swears that she died horribly as a child in a story that made the news after she fell behind the bunk bed, and we unknowingly slept next to her dead body for days. I feel absolutely sick writing this, but I've been told by a friend that writing this stuff down might be important. That same friend also told me that it wouldn't be a good idea to share my name, so I won't. I'm writing this from a Hilton Garden Inn, about 5 minutes from my apartment. I haven't been there in 2 months, but my neighbor texted me an update about it today. It sounds bad. They have torn up all of the carpet, large sections of drywall are missing, and they've started ripping out the ceiling. When I say they, I'm not sure if it's still the police or if the leasing agency has hired someone to clean up. I have pictures, letters, furniture, and memories in that apartment. It was home for almost 5 years, and I just don't care. I'll never, ever set foot in that place again. 2 months ago, we had a massive storm roll through Cincinnati. I lived in an apartment complex closer to the edge of the city. I don't want to give too many specifics, but imagine one of those cookie-cutter standalone complexes that has a few apartment buildings and a crappy pool. The rent wasn't the cheapest I could find, but the complex is gated, so I justified the cost with an increase in safety. I'm a single woman and have always been a little paranoid about living alone. Once I finished college and took a graphic design job here in the city, I realized that I no longer had a pool of college friends to choose a roommate from. I was faced with 2 options: either live by myself for the first time, or play random roommate roulette. Unimpressed by either, I decided to create a third option: my Murphy. Murphy is, or was, the greatest thing that ever happened to me. I know a lot of dog owners say that about their pets, but Murphy really was my saving grace. Moving to the city was hard for me, and starting my first real job was even harder. Being greeted by Murphy's big, goofy smile was the highlight of coming home every day. When I adopted Murphy, he was about the size of a soccer ball, and almost as round. However, it didn't take more than a couple of months before that soccer ball began growing into a mountain. Pun intended. My Murphy was a Bernese mountain dog, and at just under 120 pounds, he was more mountain than dog. He was a gentle giant, and probably not the stalwart guardian I'd adopted him to be, but he was my very best friend. We'd sit on the couch together every night, and he'd lay his head in my lap. We'd go for walks in the common areas, and the handful of older people who stroll around our complex would always give him a treat. Every night, we'd lay in bed next to one another.
This nightmare began with the storm. Our complex is kind of in the middle of corporate chain hell, surrounded by gas stations, a Red Lobster, an Outback Steakhouse. You get the gist. However, despite our proximity to the center of this commercial purgatory, we always lose power during these nasty storms. What's worse? We must be near the end of some network or grid, because we're always the last group of buildings in our area to have power restored. This storm was particularly bad. I remember getting home sometime after dark and it was pouring down rain. The leaves hadn't begun to change yet, but there were twigs and leaves all over the parking lot from the wind. Luck would have it that I slipped into my apartment just before the complex's streetlights went out. I was greeted by a dark apartment. I don't think people realize how poorly apartment complexes like this are designed in terms of natural light. My whole apartment has only 2 windows, one at the front in the kitchen and one in my little bedroom. That leaves the main hallway, both bathrooms, and the living room without light for most of the day. During an outage like this, and especially after the sun goes down, you open that door to a pitch black apartment. The primal fear one has when they're met with such darkness evaporated the minute I heard Murphy's collar jingle in from somewhere in the dark. He came bounding out, and I felt him barrel into my leg and up onto me. I scratched his heavy head, and he plopped down, trotting back into the darkened living room. I did what every sane person does when returning to a dark apartment on a stormy night. I walked through every room with my phone's light to make sure there weren't any unwelcome visitors lurking in the shadows. That split second before you throw back a shower curtain, when your mind has prepared itself for the small chance there's actually something there, can leave you on edge. Anyways, after making my rounds, it was time to brave the dreaded rain to let Murphy use the bathroom. I had been diligent in training him, and we'd actually gotten to the point where I could just stand at the top of the stairs while he'd run down to the bushes next to our building. With a quick clap, he'd bound right back up the steps and into the apartment. As I opened our front door, it really struck me just how dark it was outside. Not one of the nauseatingly bright restaurant signs was glowing, and the handful of headlights I could see through the rain were far off in the distance. The project I'm toiling on at work is for an overseas client, so I'd have to keep some weird hours to keep my meetings with him. I hadn't checked my phone when I got home, but I'm sure it was at least 11 p.m. Murphy must have darted past my leg without me even knowing. Not an uncommon occurrence, and was doing his business somewhere in the dark. I couldn't see much in the murky night, but I did catch a glance at one thing as the beam of a distant car danced down the sheets of rain. Across the parking lot, I saw a man turn 90 degrees to my building, and he was relieving himself. He was only illuminated for a second, but I swear I saw it. It isn't unusual to see drunk people stumbling around the complex at night, and I've seen a lot worse in this parking lot than a drunk dude pissing. Even still, there was something so creepy about it. The rain, the darkness. It was like he was hiding out there. Murphy took longer to come back than usual, but he eventually crawled up the steps out of the rain. I could hear him panting as he reached the top step, and he began a half-hearted shake to get the water off of his fur. We both moseyed back into the apartment. I felt my way back inside and plopped down on the couch. I used my phone screen to light my path as the little flashlight on my phone stopped working after I dropped it a few months earlier. I pulled up a blanket and started scrolling on my phone. I kept the brightness low to conserve battery. I heard Murphy thumping his way down the hall towards me, and I realized that his cadence wasn't quite right. Maybe 6 months previously, Murphy had injured one of his front paws on a piece of glass in the parking lot and developed an odd walk for the better part of 2 weeks. His cadence now was similar to that, irregular and slightly off-kilter. Even still, I felt his weight impact the couch cushions as he jumped up to join me. As I scrolled, Murphy's head nuzzled under my arm. His head felt big, and I winced at the water still clinging to his fur. Something else struck me too. Murphy stank. Don't get me wrong, a wet dog smelling bad isn't exactly unheard of, but I mean he smelled bad. It wasn't dog bad either. The only thing I could liken it to was a smell I'd encountered while I was working at Dollar General in high school. There was this guy who worked there, probably 18 or 19, who just smelled terrible all the time. Just the worst body odor you could imagine. The guy obviously didn't bathe a lot, as evidenced by his perpetually greasy hair. Murphy smelled something like that as he nuzzled his snout into my chest. I briskly patted his head and told him to go on and get off the couch. He snapped up and lumbered elsewhere. Scrolling on my phone got kind of old, and the rhythmic pattering of the rain outside was tempting my eyelids closed. Once again, feeling my way through the dark, I made my way into the bedroom, feeling bad about the scolding I had given Murphy. I called for him to join me in bed. I know some people think it's gross to let their dog sleep with them, but Murphy has always been a great pup to sleep next to. Sometimes he sleeps at the end of the bed, and other times he snuggles right up next to me. I hoped that Murphy didn't smell quite as bad now that he had some time to dry off. As I heard him in the hallway, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Not the friendly trotting of my Murphy, but the distinct, menacing footfalls of a human being. My ears rang in the silence. Just as Murphy came bounding into the room unbothered, I sighed in relief. Hearing the neighbor's footsteps isn't that uncommon, but they seldom sound that loud. I guessed that the power outage had killed all of the background noise I was used to, as there was no air conditioner or refrigerator running to muffle the sounds of apartment living. The darkness is one thing, but the silence is another. I'm glad I still had the sound of rain to serve as my white noise. Murphy jumped into the bed with one big leap. He wasn't wet anymore, but he still stank to high heaven. As he pawed at my side, I decided to pet him a little before banishing him to the end of the bed. I rubbed his big head and realized just how big he'd gotten. Looking at him grow little by little every week, it was easy to forget how large he was. I rubbed his head in the dark, marveling at how big my little pup had gotten. It seemed like Murphy was getting bigger by the hour. While I was rubbing his fur, I felt Murphy jump up and begin uncharacteristically licking my face. He'd licked and nibbled on me as a puppy, but I'd broken him of that habit a long time ago. He got in 4 or 5 licks to my face before I scolded him and pushed him off. He went silent and still. Then, without warning, he did it again, jumping up on me with his weight and licking my face. This time I yelled at him and felt his weight shift to the end of the bed. At this point I was convinced that Murphy had gotten into something outside. Maybe he'd messed with a dead animal or gotten into some garbage. Either way, he was acting odd and continued to stink up the room. I resolved to check him out in the morning and call the vet if he still wasn't acting right. I laid back down, and with Murphy perched by my feet, I checked the time on my phone. 1:15. Right as I checked it, the screen froze and the 3% battery marker in right-hand corner invited a black screen. With my phone finally dead, the decision was made for me, and I closed my eyes to go to sleep. I woke up disoriented in the dark. It had to be sometime later in the night. As my room remained dark as pitch, I woke to that foul smell and a warm sensation over my shoulder. As my wits returned, I realized that Murphy had migrated up the bed to sleep next to me. However, unlike his usual posture of curling into a massive ball, it felt like Murphy had one of his paws resting on my shoulder. I could hear him breathing, almost snoring, in a way dissimilar to my memory. Once again, I felt the hair on my neck stand up, as if I sensed something imminently wrong. That feeling faded, though, as I reached out to grab my Murphy's fur.
He felt soft and warm, and I felt him heave with every breath. I went to move his paw off my shoulder when I realized how swollen it felt. Usually I could wrap my hand all the way around Murphy's leg, but his leg felt thick and swollen in my hand. It also felt heavy as I pushed it off me. Murphy stirred and stopped his snoring but didn't move or stir. I turned around to avoid his smell and drifted back to sleep. I woke up to the earliest signs of light outside. It couldn't be any later than 7 or so. All I could see of my room was the vague outline of my door and window. Feeling the urge to pee, I rolled out of bed, only to jolt at the sound of a thud in the hallway. I froze momentarily, wondering where Murphy was. We weren't in the room, which almost certainly meant that it was him thumping around in the hallway. I made my way to the doorway, freezing once more. The door was closed. Had I closed it when I went to bed? I usually closed it, but I couldn't remember. Either way, the door was closed and Murphy wasn't with me. I twisted the knob and gently swung the door inward. Peering around the corner, I stared down the darkened hall. All at once, my heart stopped itself and retreated to the furthest reaches of my stomach. There at the end of my hallway stood a figure. It must have been at least 6 feet tall, bulky and unnatural in the bluish hue of the rainy morning. Its unnatural frame held something in its hand, but I couldn't make out what it was. What I could make out was the head, which betrayed the unquestionable silhouette of a Bernese mountain dog. It was my Murphy, but it wasn't my Murphy. Not at all. In an unnaturally swift motion, it fell from its human stance and crashed to the floor on all fours, shaking the apartment as it did. It let out an unconvincing bark, loud and guttural, staring at me through the dark. Before I could register it, the thing was bounding down the hall at me, sloppily crawling towards me on all fours. I don't remember screaming, but the hoarseness in my voice and my neighbor's call to police suggest I must have. I remember retreating to the bedroom. I remember locking the door. I remember the banging and howling from the other side as the blows to my door hit around the height of a human fist. The howls weren't my Murphy, or any dog for that matter. They sounded like the growls and screams that echo through a mental institution. There are gaps in my memory. Locking the door is so vivid in my mind, and so in the howling and screaming of that monster. What I don't remember is opening the bedroom window, or jumping into the hedges below. The rain-soaked ground must have made for a soft landing because I didn't break anything despite falling from a story up. What I haven't forgotten, and what I'll never forget, is the look he gave me from that window. The pale blue of the early morning, coupled with the cold indifference of the still pounding rain, framed that horror in my bedroom window. I looked up from my place on that muddy ground to see him glaring down from my bedroom. Tattered fur across his torso gave way to a decidedly human, albeit grotesque, human head. Stringy hair framed a pale, sickly face grinning with a nauseating row of yellowed teeth. It was the face of a man no older than 30, though twisted and aged by unspeakable depravity. He winked a soulless eye at me and closed the window. I learned later that what he'd been holding in his hand was a large paintbrush, the kind you use to paint a wall. The innocent thuds I heard that morning were the sound of that freak painting my name on the walls of my apartment with the blood of my Murphy. His name was Winton Morris. I'd never seen the man in my life. At least if I had, I'd never realized it. I knew the neighbors to the right of me, but I'd always figured that the apartment on the other side of me was empty. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it wasn't. The same goes for my downstairs neighbors, too. I always thought the unit was owned by somebody who didn't have the good sense to rent it out. For at least 2 years, I never saw anyone come or go from those apartments.
In hindsight, there were always clues that something was amiss. Little cracks in the seams of wall paneling, small holes drilled in the living room wall, floor vents that never seemed to have any airflow. I always chalked it up to the shoddy maintenance work you often find in these apartments. The detective told me there were at least 9 peepholes looking into my apartment, spread out between the downstairs unit and the one next door. Winton Norris owned them both. Winton wasn't on anybody's radar, from what the police say. He'd lived a quiet life as a programmer for the better part of his career, living in a filthy little apartment somewhere across the complex. The detective suspects he saw me walking Murphy one day, and what might have started as some creepy crush snowballed into a sick infatuation. At some point they think he got jealous of my sweet Murphy, as strange as that sounds. The prosecutor shared Winton's bank records with me a couple of weeks ago. He spent almost every penny he had on those 2 units, setting them up for his grand plan. His biggest investment, however, came in the form of that vile creation, the suit. There's a man in Japan that the detective told me about. I don't remember his name, but I do remember the photo he showed me. It was an article from Business Insider that read, "Japanese man spends $15,000 on lifelike dog costume." I encourage you to look it up, just to give you an idea of what this thing looks like. Winton had every post from this guy saved on his computer, and an endless number of computer sketches of his own dog costume. He must have spent hours upon hours, months upon months, watching Murphy and I in our home. He had to practice walking, panting, and laying down, just feet from where we lay every night. This creep was mirroring us, and longing for the night he'd replace my dog out in the rain. I don't know if he waited for the perfect night when the power was out, or if it just worked out that way. Either way, it's clear he was going to be caught. Even after closing my bedroom window, he didn't have the sanity to flee, or even to off himself. When the police arrived, they found him in the middle of the living room on all floors, completely naked, and panting like a dog. He was extremely thin. I was told he likely lost weight in the months leading up to the night in an attempt to weigh the same as my Murphy, but he never quite lost enough. That night never ends. The sense of dread I have laying awake in this hotel room is immeasurable. The determination he had to invade my life, to take my Murphy, and to spend an evening in my puppy's place, the nightmare won't end until he's gone. There's a hearing tomorrow down at the courthouse, and the detective tells me that the monster will be there. I bought a pistol from the pawn shop this morning, and have been practicing with it in the mirror all afternoon. I'm going to get a good night's sleep again, no matter what it takes. I started a job at a canned vegetable company last month. It has been an easy, boring job, at least up until yesterday, that is. On day 1, I was shown around the factory. My supervisor gave me a walkthrough of the entire factory. I saw each department and was given a brief description of what they do there. At the end of the day, I was told to come back the next day at 8 a.m. I was going to start in the boxing department, the last step in the factory. All I had to do was pull each case of canned goods off of the conveyor belt, ensure it was sealed, and place it on a pallet. It sounded easy enough. "What about that room over there?" I asked, pointing to a room with fogged windows. I could see conveyor belts going into it and coming out of it, but unlike the rest of the facility, it was closed off. All the windows were fogged, so you couldn't see inside. My boss sighed and gave me a look that told me he was tired of people asking about that room. "That room is off limits. Only restricted personnel are allowed in there." The next morning, I started my shift. About an hour into my shift, I was bored out of my mind. A box came down the conveyor belt, and I sealed it and stacked it on a pallet. Another box, sealed it, pallet. I needed a break. I waved at my supervisor and told him I needed a bathroom break. He checked his watch and shook his head. Already? He asked in a frustrated tone. I'm sorry, nature calls, I replied. He stepped over to my conveyor belt. I'll cover you until you get back. Just try to be quick, he snapped. I walked to the bathroom and turned to make sure I was out of line of sight. I was. I didn't have to use the bathroom and stood in front of the bathroom for a second. That's when I heard the noises. I heard horrible retching noises like someone was throwing up, but the noises weren't coming from the restroom. They were coming from the room with the fogged windows. I began to creep closer. The noises were becoming louder. When I reached the door, I cupped my hands over the glass to try to look inside. Someone had to have seen me, and the door opened. I almost fell over backward, but I was able to recover. A middle-aged man wearing the same uniform I had been given stood there staring at me. You must be Brett, the new guy. You were supposed to be here an hour ago, he said. The wrenching sound was even louder now with the door open. I could hear other people talking inside the room. I wasn't Brett, but I needed to see what was going on inside. I knew that when my supervisor noticed I didn't come back, I would be fired. Or worse, if Brett showed up and they figured out I was lying, I would be in serious trouble. It was worth it. I hated this job anyways. The man brought me into the room. He pointed to a conveyor belt that led into a machine. The cans will come in this side. The machine will seal them, and they will come out the other side sealed and with a label. Your job is to make sure they are sealed. If you see any leaking, pull them and place them in this barrel, okay? I nodded. It was simple. I wanted to look around to see what was causing the noise, but the cans began flowing in. Cans of peas were moving into the machine and coming out sealed. I watched them for several minutes and didn't see any that had failed to seal, but I did notice that all of them were dented. I decided to turn and ask the man what to do with the dented cans. It would be the perfect excuse to look around the room. As I turned the corner around a large piece of equipment, I saw it. A huge green insect was standing there. It was easily 6 feet tall and resembled a praying mantis. The creature was chained to the floor and vomited violently into a 55-gallon barrel. 2 men were scooping the vomit and pouring small amounts into each can of peas as they passed by. I screamed in disgust. The man who had led me into the room turned to me. He ran over and began to yell at me. You need to get back to your station. If one of those cans get through unsealed, it can ruin everything. Within hours of being exposed to air, these eggs can hatch. He screamed at me. Eggs? What is that thing? I demanded. Tom didn't brief you before he sent you down here? He asked. I said nothing. I just stared in horror at the giant insect. Yeah, eggs. That thing is an alien. We have an arrangement with their species. It says here, lays eggs and we spread them through the food chain. We estimate about 1 in 100 eggs that are consumed by a human will hatch, consuming the human from within, he explained. But why would you do this? I asked. I wanted to puke. The huge insect was staring at me while it continued to vomit. Brett, you were supposed to have been up to speed already. We didn't have a choice. They supply us with tech, and we have to offer hosts to incubate their offspring. The cans are dented so we can track how many we put into circulation. And at least the only people that will be lost are poor people and cheap people looking for a bargain. He told me. That was it. I couldn't hold back anymore. I ran to the trash can and vomited. The man patted me on the shoulder. Brett, I need you to get back to your station. Besides, it's not half as bad as what they're doing with the corn.